right, should we get started? Yeah? Well, welcome everybody, both to AEI as well as those who are watching virtually. And we're delighted at American Enterprise Institute to host this part of this series, Beyond the SCIF, which is a very important effort undertaken by the House Intelligence Committee to engage with foreign policy and national security communities outside the SCIF, outside the House Intelligence Community, on leading edge threats to U.S. national and economic and health security. We're thrilled to have Chairman Turner here with us. We'll say a few things momentarily, and Congressman Brad Wenstrup, who's really a leading figure in the defense, health world as a physician and a surgeon and an Army officer. So we're thrilled to have him, and he's also doing very important work on trying to uncover this immensely important question of where did COVID originate, as well as many other things that he's doing. Really, we don't really need a more vivid illustration of what can go wrong with bio threats, because we lived through one, which was the COVID-19 pandemic. Not saying that it was, not taking a position yet on waiting for Congressman Wenstrup's report on the origination, but we can see what happens when you're unprepared for pathogens and viruses, wiping out untold millions of people and throwing so many into poverty and creating a global crisis and so forth. So imagine, what America's adversaries and enemies learned from just watching that. And you can have an illustration in your mind of the kinds of things we need to protect ourselves against. China's also a competitor industrially and biotech, catching up in many respects scientifically, and will be a fairly ruthless one as well. So we have a great panel. I'll just quickly introduce the panel and turn it over to Chairman Turner. We have people who actually know something about biology, which is not me. We have Dov Zakheim here, who has served in very senior roles at the Department of Defense and is a commissioner on the Emerging Biotechnology and Security Commission. We have Ken Staley from Palantir, who is a trained physician who told me he never practiced, but has a lot of experience in public health. We have Tony Ruggiero, who has served in a number of National Security Council positions, and most recently as the Senior Director for Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction Threats. And we have Anna Puglisi, who has had a number of government intelligence jobs and think tank jobs, and writes prolifically on biology and biotech and China. And we're thrilled to have these experts, and of course Congressman Wenstrup, who will be leading and moderating the panel as well. So thank you, and I'll turn it over to you, Chairman Turner.
Great. Dan, thank you so much for hosting this today and for everything that American Enterprise Institute does in the space of national security. Convening people together who are some of the top-notch in both research and in thought and policy really does help policymakers and legislators like ourselves to be able to look and fashion as to what the agenda should be, what some of the threats are that we have to look for in the future, and how do we respond to them. I thank you for hosting this Beyond the SCIF. When I was chosen to be chairman of the Intelligence Committee, I was given two tasks by Speaker McCarthy at that time. One was to return the committee back to a focus on national security, accomplishing that through reinstilling a bipartisan ethic in the committee. And we've done that. I have to thank Jim Himes, my ranking member, and really all of the members of the committee, because it really does take every individual to make the decision to work in a bipartisan manner, and we have worked in a bipartisan manner. The second was to open up the committee, that we didn't want to just be people who went down to the basement of the Capitol and learned interesting things, but the intelligence that we receive, the intelligence that's given to Congress, is done so that it can impact policymaking and decision-making. That how do we translate these important intelligence products into the jurisdictional work of Congress? And so we reconnected the committees and the committee chairs to the Intelligence Committee so that we could say, what were their priorities? What intelligence do we have that's relevant to their jurisdiction? And it also then, it was to, in opening up, look outside of the Intelligence Committee itself to find individuals like yourselves who have expertise, who can help us fashion our to-do list, inform us as to the things that we need to be challenging the intelligence community on and things that we need to be incorporating into our agenda. So thank you for being a part of that today. Dr. Brad Wenstrup, who is going to be hosting this panel. This is actually the second he's had this year. The Ronald Reagan Institute hosted a bio threats and artificial intelligence weaponization event in January. Dr. Wenstrup, both from his background and his work in Congress, has really fashioned leadership as this a space for himself. One, he is a surgeon himself, having served in the Army, retiring as a colonel. He is the chair, as you said, Dan, of our coronavirus origins subcommittee that he has led as chair of that committee to question the data and information that both the public and Congress have received and the work that the intelligence community has done to identify origins. And origins are important. I'm certain that will fashion somewhat the discussion today because, as you said, Dan, we are facing unprecedented threats, both natural and man-made, and of course the issue of great concern of national security of the weaponization of pathogens. Dr. Wenstrup has been a leader in our committee. I always describe it as when someone is a member of our committee and has unique capabilities, they have the ability to take the intelligence community down farther in a discussion than the regular members. We all can think of what the first question should be. Dr. Wenstrup's on the fourth and fifth question, really challenging them both on their work and also how their work is relevant to us. We're very sorry that Dr. Wenstrup is going to be retiring this year from Congress, but because of his expertise and the work he's done, we're looking for him to remain active in the public discussion and in certainly the work of Congress. And Dr. Wenstrup, I know everyone is eager today to hear your perspective on these important topics. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Excellent. Thank you.
All right, well, it looks like the gang's all here. Dan, thank you. Thank AEI, for hosting us here today. AEI, through my 12 years in Congress, been involved with just about anything I've been involved with. We know we can always rely on you for some input, and I want to thank Chairman Turner for his kind remarks. And it has been important that we open ourselves up to the public, I think, in a lot of things that we do. In the Intelligence Committee for a long time, it was probably you go in there and the intelligence community just tells you what they're doing. But we really are now in a place where we are engaging. We are trying to engage as subject matter experts as best as we can when we do this. So we like opportunities like this where we can engage with the public as well. As legislators, we want to hear from experts, stakeholders, and get feedback from those that are out there in the trenches every day. And so this is our opportunity. I will tell you that, for example, with bioweapons, being on Intelligence Committee, being Army 25 years, I deployed to Iraq for 1 year, always concerned about bioweapons, and I was looking at that even before COVID and what our adversaries may be up to. But COVID obviously highlighted it even more, and I can remember during lockdown, I was looking and researching with another doctor at home in Ohio, trying to figure out how we're going to treat patients. What's going on physiologically with people and how do we counter that to try and keep people alive? And at the same time, one day he sends me this one, he goes, take a look at this. And it was a published article from 2015, actually with Ralph Barrick in North Carolina and Dr. Zhengli Shi in China, where they created a chimera, where they took parts of viruses to create a new virus, and as known now as gain-of-function research. So that set off a real alarm into what we're doing and concern with any of our adversaries may be doing. I do want to say that February of this year, the intelligence community noted that the threat from emerging biotechnologies, now I quote, current biological agents and rapidly advancing biotechnology underscore the diverse and dynamic nature of deliberate biological threats. Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, probably maintain the capability to produce pathogens and toxins, and China and Russia have proven to be adept at manipulating the information that may be out there in this space. And we have to be able to have confidence in our countermeasures and through U.S. biotechnology and research. And so the discussion today involves that. We have experts here, and I think it's timely, and I think it'll be very informative to those that are here in person and those that are watching virtually. Before we begin, I want to let everybody know there'll be a Q&A session following our moderated discussion, and I'm excited about the panelists that we have here today. They've been introduced. You've gotten some of their background. So let me start off with this question, and maybe a short answer to get us started as an opener, but given the work that you do, you each have an opportunity to sort of tell the audience about your work in this space and maybe lay the foundation for the rest of our conversation, and we'll just go down the line.
Well, thanks very much, and thank you to AEI for having me. It's not the first time you and I have interacted over this issue. The commission is unusual in a number of respects. We've got 2 senators, 2 congresspeople, 2 R's and 2 D's, so we're bipartisan, and we have not just bipartisanship in the sense of membership, but bipartisanship in the sense of commitment to what we're trying to do. And as a commission, we've got a number of tasks that go to some of the things you've already said. For instance, you mentioned that there will be people not just here, but watching this. One of our goals is to have an educated public. Think about AI. Where was AI 5 years ago? And where is it today? And how many people know about AI, or at least talk about it as if they know about it, as opposed to 5 years ago? Just take the words AI out and put the words biotech in. Maybe not 5 years, maybe 7 years. We want to have an educated public. So that's number one. Number two, and again you mentioned this, you talked about COVID. National security isn't just about DOD or the IC. It goes across the board, both in terms of all of government activities, such as dealing with COVID, or in terms of the threat, which is across the board too. So that's a second area that we're trying to emphasize. We're trying to look over the next hill or over the next mountain range and see what's coming at us. We're trying to encourage public-private partnerships. In other words, we've got a series of goals, and we've issued some white papers that are on the web. You can see them. We've written letters to Congress suggesting certain activities without taking positions on particular legislation, but making suggestions, so that we're not just issuing a report, and we did issue an interim report and then another one in December, but we're actively trying to prompt a discussion that covers a lot of territory, because this subject, biotech, and certainly when it's combined with AI, literally covers the earth. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here today, and thank you for the invitation. And also for that introduction, because I'm going to pick up, I think, where Dov just left off, and talk about, because we're talking about potential, the potential of biotechnology. And it has to do with food, has to do with medicine, but also supply chains and our ability to harness biology to make things. And there's so much potential, but there's also the potential for misuse. And so, and then we add AI on top of that as a tool of discovery. And these are not the future issues or sci-fi. This is today. And it's been just amazing to see the gains and growth in this field. And also the importance of, as my colleague mentioned, ensuring that the American public understands where this field is going and the great potential. And it's also really important because the US and like-minded nations really we need to work together on this issue because we want to make sure that these technologies are developed with our values moving forward. And key to be in those areas where national security and commerce sometimes diverge. So things with longer timelines, things that are not immediately able to be commercialized. And in that divide, we need to be able to provide that support. And key with this is going to be competition with China. China has a plan and a goal, and it's been really interesting to watch that unfold over the last 2+ decades. It's made biotechnology a priority. It's put in place the building blocks to build out that technology area in a very similar way that what we've seen both with manufacturing, with telecommunications. And those building blocks, in a lot of ways, create dependencies. Those include talent, those include investments. And when we look at that infrastructure, sequencing capacity, contract research organizations, non-human primates. And China really blurs public, private, civilian, and military, and that creates challenges in the way this technology is being developed. And you add AI and bio into that, and we see an incredible focus by the Chinese government on those areas. And moving forward, it'll be important to have a strategy to promote this kind of technology, but then also to protect our innovation base. With that.
Well, excuse me, good morning. Thanks for having me. When you work in the weapons of mass destruction field, most of the times there's not a lot of good news. So I guess I would say in terms of what I'm working on, at least in this sphere, doing a lot of worrying, right? When you think about biosecurity and COVID, the key question that comes up is are we ready? For whatever the next one is. And maybe we're already in the next one and we don't know it yet. So you worry about, or at least I worry about a lot of those things. When you think about, COVID origins is an important aspect of that and figuring out where it came from. I've certainly been very public that I believe it came from the lab, but I know that that's not definitive yet and that others have views on that. But I also think about what has the debate over our COVID response and COVID origins really done to the confidence between the federal government and our public, between the state and local authorities. And then also the thing that I think most people have seen is our confidence in what our scientists say before and during and after an outbreak. And those are serious concerns. Because if we had another bio-related event, whether it was man-made or natural, that would be all of those. We would need all of those for an effective response. And what was mentioned before is the thing that I learned the most. There are a lot of things I learned the most during the COVID pandemic in the White House, but one of the things was the importance of non-traditional national security agencies. I think it's obvious now that HHS is an important non-traditional national security agencies, but now with the outbreak that we're seeing in cattle here in America, we're seeing the importance of the agricultural department. I certainly saw that. Many people probably don't remember the unsolicited seeds that came presumably from China in 2020. I remember that. Agriculture was a big part of that. So reinforcing that when we think about pandemic preparedness, that we have non-traditional national security agencies that are ready for what they might have to do in that type of an outbreak.
Well, first, thanks for having us here today. I think this is a really timely and important discussion. As mentioned at the top, I'm a senior counselor at Palantir. That's a data and analytics company. I have a health background, and before that, I'd served in national security and public health positions in the federal government. At Palantir, we work with life sciences companies every day to try to deliver on the promise of what AI and the life sciences together can do to provide new life-saving treatments. But we know with the democratization of the knowledge that's coming with AI, there's an increasing threat of misuse and abuse, and even people trying to create bioweapons to harm us. Now, I would say in the same breath as I say that this isn't a new challenge. I think the democratization of data has been occurring for decades. And so it's really important at this moment, as we're just on the verge of the AI and life sciences revolution, to think about ways that we can mitigate the threat. So if I think about the way we mitigate the threat, I think there are two paradigm shifts that are really important to consider. And Dov and others, I think, have already reflected this. But the first, I think, is that the life sciences, both in the public and the private sector, need to be considered a core component of our national security. And that's a step change. That's a real change in thinking. But from a tool perspective, from a software perspective, we believe that software is what will transform our national security posture and be a core component of the defense in depth that's required for biodefense and biosecurity. And so just to make that tangible, 3 quick examples. One is biosurveillance. We believe that software and analytics can help us rapidly detect outbreaks long before we've done it before. We believe that it can enhance supply chains so that you can deliver medical materials rapidly from where they're produced to where they're needed. And we think, as another example, that biomanufacturing and manufacturing in general, which is due to undergo a real revolution, can allow us to start to have the capacity and the ability to ramp quickly that would allow us to prepare better and respond better to threats that are there. So, in sum, I think sitting up here as someone in industry, from the software industry, we really do think that it's important to consider software as a new core component of all of our national security.
Well, thank you. I focus on China policy and Asia policy. So I think a lot about China and all the sort of malign influence, including in this space, that China projects out into the world. I did have the opportunity to do some work for the Department of Defense, where I conscripted biologists and pharmaceutical executives and so forth to look at how China is competing. And there are 4 things that I like people to focus on, or that I'm focused on, that I took away from that work. The first is looking at the sort of industrial model that China has used, as Anna said before, in telecommunications and semiconductors and so forth, this kind of what the China scholar and former official Liza Tobin calls this brute force industrial policy that puts others out of business through subsidies and IP theft and so forth. And one of our questions was, is that possible in the biotech field? And in some ways it is. So we all know about, we all sort of are familiar with supply chain issues, such as how China behaved during COVID, hoarding a lot of the medical supplies and so forth that they are dominant in, as well as the active pharmaceutical ingredients issue, as well as the fact that so many generic drugs that we take in the United States are manufactured in China. So we sort of are familiar, I think, broadly with that supply chain issue. I think less well known is something Anna was mentioning, which is China's starting to occupy the mid-tier of a segment of the value chain, which is this preclinical services, testing on animals, toxicology research, what in the pharma business they call CROs and CDMOs. China's really starting to get a dominant position in that mid-tier, which to me, watching China, is part of their playbook. That's what they did in critical minerals too, dominating the processing. So not necessarily the high end and the low end, but starting to dominate this middle end. Mm-hmm. And through that, you can gain a lot of leverage. So you can gain a lot of leverage into leveraging the United States. The United States basic R&D enterprise is second to none for all kinds of reasons. But China can gain a lot of leverage over that enterprise through occupying this tier. So that's something I'm watching very closely. I don't think it's out there enough. I think one day we'll wake up and say they've done in this segment what they did in critical mineral processing, which is just be the place that's doing all that work. The other place I am looking a bit is on the high end, so CRISPR and CAR-T. It's my understanding that although most of the greatest discoveries are in the United States, China is a very fast follower and actually at this point has 1.5 clinical trials in CAR T for every one that we have. That's my understanding right now. And there's already been abuses in China on CRISPR and so on, but they're going to have a lot of say on the standards and the ethical norms around CRISPR, which is problematic. I do look at the People's Liberation Army. It's a little bit in science fiction right now in terms of how they're using biology and so forth, but they're very interested in this area that they call cognitive warfare, which sounds like psychological warfare and so forth. It's not. There's a lot of PLA studies on brain science and how you deal with cognition and how cognition and brain science fits with intelligence and warfare, so AI and so forth. And I'll finally end by saying that, you talk to a lot of scientists and others in the pharmaceutical field, and they say, well, what does it matter, if China has more discoveries than we have in CAR T and applications? But let's just look at the way China acted in COVID. I mean, we still don't have an answer to how COVID originated, and that's solely because the PRC covered it up. I mean, they from misinformation to destruction of lab materials, to destruction of medical, to the silencing of doctors, to the silencing of journalists. Why does anybody think that this is an area, public health broadly, that we're going to get cooperation with China? I think people are still really chasing that dream. When China policy people talk about areas of cooperation, they still mention public health. But COVID behavior should, at the very least, destroy the notion that we're going to get cooperation on public health and science from China. So I'll end there.
Well, I have to say, I couldn't have asked for a better opening round from everybody. I think you touched on just about every question that I had lined up to ask and talk about today, so I'm extremely grateful. If you're watching this later, play it a couple times, because there was really a lot of good information that was shared here today. And the threats, that, with the technology comes the positive and comes the negative. And that's just the fact. And when it comes to the select subcommittee on the pandemic, I talk about we're doing an after-action review. We want to learn lessons from what happened so that in the future we may be able to predict a pandemic and prepare ourselves, protect ourselves, and maybe even prevent it. It's pretty challenging and pretty daunting, especially when you see how advanced things are. One of the things about nature or the lab, what we do know is the capability to create a very deadly virus exists. And it exists in Wuhan, China. The cover-up that you mentioned, no cooperation from China, destroying sequences, et cetera. This will all be in our report what we do have. And at the same time, we do want to protect ourselves and be able to predict something from nature, too. We want to have that in our armamentarium, if you will. National security, national health security, if we're not a healthy nation, we're not a secure nation. That's the bottom line. It was mentioned, our values. How do we get the world to adhere to our values? And that's the real challenge when it comes to, what you were just talking about, dealing with China. You talked about pharmaceuticals, our supply chain, and the active pharmaceutical ingredients. That China controls that with our generic medications. We are at their mercy. These are things we have to make some changes on. It's not only that they control those things, they're making drugs. We can't be sure about the quality a lot of times. You talk about research. If they can dominate the supply of, say, humanized mice that are used for research in an effort to protect us, that's a problem for us. So all of these things you really touched, and food supply too, I think it was really important. Our subcommittee, we went to Europe, we met with the WHO, we met with the World Health Organization on animals and agriculture. All of this is extremely important to our security, obviously. So with the landscape changing and CCP's action and reaction during the pandemic and subsequently from the pandemic, how has it changed our strategies? How should our strategies be changing, Dabney? And everyone touched on that somewhat, but maybe more specifically because of their behavior through this process. Why don't we start at the other end and work our way back? Or anybody who wants to answer.
I tend to admire problems and think less about the answers to them, particularly in this area. But that's a great question. So the supply chain issues that you mentioned, I think, need to be addressed and addressed quickly. As you say, dependencies. If if there's a conflict in the Western Pacific, people focus on semiconductors and so on, but the fact that certain medicines wouldn't be available is just something that we have to address and address fast. I think when it comes to I think we have to end the hope that there's going to be this great public health cooperation with China, which has been around since since I started in this business 24 years ago. It's really not going to happen. It may happen at the individual scientific level, but it's not going to happen, state to state or country to country. And then I would say on this sort of mid-tier of the supply chain where China's getting a dominant position, we have to, we have policies in place to reshore and rejigger supply chains in other areas. And I think we really have allies who can do some of this work. We have, incentives that we can create to do some of this work. But we really cannot, China's strategy is essentially one of gaining economic leverage. And we have to see that they're gaining economic leverage in this particular space. And we need a set of trade and other incentives such that they are not the dominant player in preclinical services and in manufacturing.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I'll pick up on supply chains, but I'll start at the beginning. And I think one of the most important things we can do based on our lessons from COVID and really from the last 20 years is find ways to enhance our surveillance and detection. So, by the time there's a common understanding of disease, we often are facing a forest fire instead of just a fire on the kitchen stove. And so you can look back. SARS was 5 months. Ebola was months in 2014. MERS was probably over a year. And there were months of delay when we were trying to find out about COVID. So it's obvious that whatever mechanisms we have today need to be supplemented with additional ones. And again, speaking from a software perspective, I would say that there's just sort of marching down from left to right. First, there's the ability now to aggregate lots of non-traditional health data and non-traditional non-health data, and then analyze it and look for signals that some sort of outbreak may be occurring. So you can identify places that you need to ask the question. Second, there's been a lot of work on point-of-care diagnostics. So pathogen agnostic point-of-care diagnostics. DARPA had a program that started in 2010, the Public Health and Disease Project. And there's been work since then. But these point-of-care diagnostics can generate data that can then be shot to the cloud, analyzed against a huge library of data, and you can understand down to the family, and in some cases the exact virus, what's happening. So you can more quickly characterize the threat. And then finally, and this seems like a simple one, but it really is, it's been a challenge. There are multiple different organizations that have different data formats, and so it makes sharing of information when they're trying to come to a common understanding of what's occurring difficult. And again, software can both harmonize all that data very quickly and allow for people to have a common view of what's been collected. But it also can allow differential access if there are concerns about different people seeing different parts of the information you've gathered. On supply chains, I just think what would have been impossible in the past, collecting all the different data points on supply chains and understanding their interconnectivity, is now possible. And so there's an opportunity for us to have a much more thoughtful analysis and understanding of situational awareness, really, of where we have potential vulnerabilities so that we can shore those up from a national security perspective.
Can I add something to that? I agree with you. This surveillance, enhanced surveillance detection, all those things, early warnings. You can even monitor open source things to pick up some information. The concern we have is how much can we do just as the United States of America, and then who are our trusted partners in this process? Because what showed during the pandemic is the WHO had no authority over China, and they weren't being transparent. So we need to form the alliances, I think, with our allies and other trusted partners and be able to verify what we're hearing. So I appreciate that thought. Thank you. Yeah.
And that's sort of where I was going to go as well, is I think there might be a tendency to, when we talk about COVID origins and what China did, and forget they're still doing that, right? They are hiding this information. There's a lot of information that the Chinese have. I mean, the congressman's hearing, I believe it was last week, really proved that there is information out there that China is not providing that is preventing a true international investigation. I think the WHO knows that their investigation was not legitimate from the beginning because it was a collaborative with China. And one of the things we're not seeing in the discourse is that later this month, the WHO is planning to consider a pandemic treaty. And so, part of that is that's been negotiated over the last couple of years, but we haven't had what I would say, this conversation we're having is something, when you think about an Ebola outbreak in Africa, that's very different from even the SARS-1 outbreak, which China again also tried to hide and was shamed into, saying that it was happening, and then the SARS-2, which is COVID-19, which they also hid. But there's a difference between cooperating countries and non-cooperating countries. And as a policy debate and an academic debate, we really haven't had that conversation of how the United States will approach those different kinds of countries. I think there's and I certainly was in the government and understand what that mechanism is that I think there's this assumption that when there is an outbreak, put aside natural or lab or whatever, that everyone will cooperate. The countries will always cooperate. And I think that's the backbone of this pandemic treaty. And yes, that probably exists amongst us and our allies and partners, but it does not exist amongst our adversaries. And so the key question to me is, how do you deal with that when you have to have two different sets of essentially pandemic preparedness and response? And I would say we're not really having that conversation yet.
Great, and I'm going to pick up from there because I think really what it comes down to, it's hard and it's easy, right? Because we need policies for the China that we have, not the one that we want. And it really comes down to that transparency, reciprocity, and what are those global norms, not only in pandemic preparedness, but also the global norms of science. Because we see this is a much broader issue than even biotech in the way our institutions, both academic and commercial, have to deal with the policies and programs that China has put in place, especially that target our innovation base, but also extract information. And I think some of the things that we've heard here today about the dependencies and really a growing part of our development cycle and research base being dependent on different aspects because we're always looking for, okay, what is that lowest cost as opposed to value, and looking at the innovation base and research base as critical infrastructure.
Well, you asked for a strategy, and you can't have a strategy if every agency in the United States government has its own strategy, which they do. Now, how do you get whole of government beyond just being a phrase? The Singapores, our commission was out there recently, they just have one overarching agency. It's a small country. It's not the United States. We've got to figure out how we can actually have all our agencies working in tandem. Who's going to oversee them? Who's going to allocate funds? Who's going to decide these sorts of things? That's number one. You've heard a little bit about working with allies. You mentioned it, Congressman. We are ad hoc with our allies right now. We don't have any real structure for working on a regular basis with them. Maybe we should look at AUKUS, which essentially institutionalizes R&D amongst three countries, us, the Brits, and the Aussies, and look at the Pillar 2 part, which is the R&D part, and use that as a kind of model. We know the Japanese just have talked about coming into AUKUS. The Prime Minister of Japan was just here, met with President Biden, and oh, by the way, they talked about biotech. We were just in Japan as well. What about actually building things as opposed to just researching or developing them, if we really want to stay ahead of China, we don't build to scale. Other than in the health field, when it comes to agriculture, when it comes to other areas, you got to go to Europe. We were over in Belgium and we saw what they can do to build to scale. We need to do that as well, which means public-private partnerships. Have we institutionalized that? Not entirely, not even close. So if you're going to have a strategy, you got to think about all of these different things. And oh, by the way, and this is just me speaking, not the commission. The commission has been looking at the issues I just mentioned. If you think about how China has always operated, it's on the basis of Sun Tzu's principles. If you don't have to fire a bullet, you don't. Well, biotech gives them the ability not to have to fire a bullet. And just think of this possible example. They infect our food, they infect our grain, right? Through some kind of gene editing. Those grains become bread. That bread gets served at a mess hall. How many hundreds of soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines might be killed because of that bread? And a shot was not fired.
Yeah, thanks. Another good round. You know, I was thinking about the WHO when the whole pandemic started, and I said, well, the WHO should be an entity that exists to benefit all of humankind, and politics should be out of it, and governments should basically be out of it. Just leave it to scientists, et cetera. You know, when I look at China, they don't want to be the country to be known as the one where viruses originate. And no one particularly does. But do you want to be known as the country that's going to take responsibility for things and try to cure things? That's the difference. And that's why I think it's important as we're looking at the pandemic treaty that you're talking about. I've been going through it. You know, a lot of times they talk about equity. And I was like, well, I'm not sure what that's supposed to mean. To me, it should mean equitable as far as transparency and accountability from each nation. That's what I think should be equitable. And I certainly appreciate the notion we're ad hoc with our allies in a lot of perspective. And those are things we have to drive more, is to be more cooperative with our allies. And I think we can make a difference. So you also mentioned public-private partnerships, so I think can go into the next question, which is as something comes forward, look, we had basically a public-private partnership with Operation Warp Speed, right? I've been saying as we look at all the problems within our government and our country, when something comes upon us as rapidly as a pandemic, should we have a scientific and manufacturing reserve corps that is ready to go to work in a moment's notice? Maybe change what you're manufacturing to fit the needs. Those are things that we've been talking about with the committee. Standards for lab safety across the country and make sure that those things are being adhered to. But let's talk for a second, if we can, about medical countermeasures. Of course, I'm a little biased as a physician, and I want to know about medical countermeasures, and I think about the medic out in the field when something like this happens. So how quickly, what are some of the things we can do so that we can have a quick reaction force to something that comes upon us quickly? Anyone? No particular order. Go ahead.
Sure. I think looking into how we responded to the COVID pandemic, both in the previous administration and the current administration, there are certain things that can be set aside. I think the debate of whether the strategic national stockpile is for a nationwide event or regional events is certainly some part of the conversation. The other aspect of that is that we've had a few other outbreaks since then, right? We've had the Mpox, I guess what we used to call monkeypox. We have whatever's going on now with the bird flu, and as I saw, I think over the weekend, we might have another Ebola outbreak in the DRC while they're dealing with other health and security-related challenges. So there's a way to look at both the domestic and international response, because of course, when there's an outbreak in Africa, many Americans go over there and respond. And so, looking at it more broadly of, did we learn some of those lessons from COVID-19, and are there things that we can do better? I think internally within the U.S. government, thinking through exercises and other places where, who would really be in charge. I know early on there was a conversation about HHS, and that morphed to FEMA, and maybe that worked the right way, and we could have done that earlier on in the process. That's something to investigate as well. But I think, part of the challenge is not knowing what may pop up, right? I mean, agriculture, and not to pick on them, but I don't think they believe, so hopefully now they believe they're a national security agency that needs to work through this. But what other department that we're not as focused on now will have some kind of role in this kind of event? I think it's something we don't know yet.
Well, I used to be the comptroller of the Pentagon, so I think in green eye shade terms. You always have to follow the money, and one of the issues is the money available to put out there in the event of something that hits you that you weren't anticipating? Now, it's very difficult to move monies around from one account to another. Mm-hmm. That's your purview, Congressman, but
it's challenging.
It is challenging. And maybe we ought to be thinking about it once we define an emergency. OMB gets the ability to move money from one agency to another quickly. Because if you want to build up, say, a counter to a COVID, you got to fund somebody to do it, or at least provide the seed money for them to do it, because you want them to turn around the counteracting drug very quickly and in large numbers at scale. In order to do that, somebody's got to kickstart them. And you kickstart with funds. But say agriculture is a great example. They're not exactly the Defense Department when it comes to budgets. But if they're going to be the ones facing a particular threat, they've got to get the money in order to fund, say, Palantir, right? Software fixes. Now, maybe you'll do it yourselves, but maybe not. Maybe you're cash-strapped. So there has to be a vehicle, a new kind of approach to how we deal with these sorts of emergencies, so that the government isn't just issuing instructions, which it has to do, but also providing the wherewithal for those instructions to be followed. Now, again, I'm not speaking for the commission here. I'm just speaking from bitter experience.
And I think that really highlights how so much of what we've done is reactionary as opposed to having a strategy in place. And we were very fortunate of those early investments in technology that allowed us to move very quickly for the COVID crisis. But I think the lessons learned from that is how important those initial investments are to have those technologies. But I think it also highlights the challenge of capacity and redundancy, not only in our biomanufacturing, but and medicines and some of those critical supply chains. And so I think it really comes back to, how do you put in place those strategies ahead of time so that we're not always so reactionary?
I think when I think about public-private partnerships, I tend to think in terms of two buckets. So you mentioned Operation Warp Speed, and I think that's where we can learn some great lessons, right? That's the government finding a way to convene non-traditional partners, allowing each company in the private sector to have its comparative advantage utilized, and then de-risking it for them. Now, we did that in an emergency. I think that first category ought to be thinking about the way in which we can keep a warm capacity. So just like at munitions commands, they have warm capacity that isn't always utilized but is ready at a moment's notice. We ought to think about that for the things that were constructed for warp speed and for the things like that. I think there's also something at steady state that we ought to be thinking about with private-public partnerships. And I'll go back to biosurveillance and a company that I've advised in the past. So one of the companies I've advised in the past actually collects fever data anonymized from households. And then using software and analytics, it can predict whether there's an illness that's going to occur in a community 5 to 10 days before it would ever hit the hospital system. Now, the private sector capital flows really well when there's a big market opportunity. This isn't a huge market opportunity, right? Over-the-counter cold and flu medicine companies will buy the data because they want to make sure their supply chain is there so they don't run out of product. But with just a little investment from the public sector, you've got an exponentially better view of what's occurring across the country long before you hit the hospital system. And so I think at steady state, we want to look at some of those players who have valuable technologies and valuable insights that we could just plus up a little bit and that could be used for public good.
I've got two observations listening to this very rich discussion. One is there's a very important country for biosurveillance that's not allowed into the WHO, and it's called Taiwan. And my understanding of their response to the pandemic is that they were picking up on social media tweets, people coming back from China. They picked up on it very, very fast. And obviously the language capability, the interactions between the two. And we're not, I had an idea early on in the pandemic. I mean, this would be a twofer or a threefer, which is why not set up with Taiwan a biosurveillance, pandemic surveillance center of excellence in Asia, and we would be able to use their capabilities in biosurveillance and their language capabilities, and it has some added benefits as well, that are diplomatic in nature. But the WHO not allowing Taiwan, which had this response in, is just unconscionable, and not even as an observer. The other observation on public-private partnerships is, Operation Warp Speed. I mean, that was really an unbelievable accomplishment, as everybody has on this panel knows. We're not thinking in terms of geostrategic competition, though, because we had this with our allies, this excellent vaccine that was much better than any other, than the Chinese vaccine, the Russian vaccine, and so forth. Somehow we didn't get much diplomatic benefit. We didn't have a strategy, a public health, as far as I can tell, a public health development strategy that gave it to key partners who were suffering the most. I think we went through the WHO or some other international organization to allocate the vaccine, which slowed things down. We don't recognize we're in this competition, multidimensional competition with China, if we're not putting the best of the United States out, which in this case was this fast and effective vaccine. We're not really competing, right? And we're not targeting it at the countries that need it the most. We're not gaining any diplomatic benefits from that and so forth. So I think we still have to be in this mindset of we're in a competition. The Chinese would have done it if they had the better vaccine. They're going to compete ruthlessly, and we have to think in the same terms.
I'm glad you brought that up about Taiwan on a couple of fronts, and also what opportunities exist for us as a country, especially with a vaccine that was more successful than anybody else's. In some ways, I don't think we're completely honest with the public about it. From the beginning, we knew that if you got vaccinated, you could still get COVID, but you're less likely to get sick. And bold claims were sometimes made more by politicians than by scientists. That was a problem. If Taiwan is not part of humankind, then I don't understand that at all. And so therefore the WHO is a political organization and not really there to benefit everybody in the world. So that becomes very clear through that process. But I agree with you. Work with them. Matter of fact, if you had your choice in this pandemic between China and Taiwan, take Taiwan, because they're willing to share their information and be honest and upfront about it. Interestingly, the CDC in Vietnam, I've spent a lot of time in the region in the past few years, and in Vietnam, for example, the CDC, our CDC, worked with their CDC, and they love us for what we did. It was vaccine diplomacy for sure, and Vietnam did pretty well. And they're certainly very able to protect their borders, and they're concerned about their sovereignty. And so that was a benefit to exactly what you just said. But then again, who is the organization that should be doing it? In that case, it was the CDC, and both sides said that it was of great benefit. So we appreciate that. So You started talking about when it comes to funding. I really appreciate the thought of when we have an emergency, we can shift monies around. It doesn't make any sense, these silos that we barricade ourselves in. There's not even a door out once it's established. And we've got to go in that direction to be able to handle things, I think. So, you know, as we're going into the NDAA this year and other legislation coming forward, I'd love to have everyone's ideas on thoughts that would help benefit us in this whole of government effort, if you would.
Okay. We actually have come up with a list of recommendations for both the NDAA and the IAA. For DOD, more testing of AI and biotech combined. Now look, AI is a tool. And so if you have a large language model and you don't have a biologist who knows what he's talking about, it ain't going to mean a thing. But DOD needs to look at that combination and what that means in terms of the things DOD worries about, which is the threat. Another thing DOD can look at is the whole question of biomanufacturing. If you have a supply chain concern, then you've got to focus on biomanufacturing, which means manufacturing to scale. It's not enough to simply have something that looks great in a lab, even if it works. You got to produce it at scale. You got to go back to the Model T Ford approach. If you don't do that, you're not helping anybody, really. For the IC staff, we've just talked over and over again about how China is totally opaque. Might throw Russia in there as well. And as we've seen in Ukraine, the two aren't exactly working at cross purposes. So the more the IC staff can get a better assessment of staffs, of biotechnology threats, the better. You know, you don't say how much is enough with this. Just keep pushing. Also, you need ongoing risk assessments over and over again. Where do we stand relative to the risk? Today, tomorrow, next week, next month, next year. And finally, assess what's going on globally, the global competition. So these are some things that the Commission is putting out there as recommendations. They're not the final answer, but we've got to start somewhere. And that's the key to us. Get going, get moving. One other possibility, we know that there is a big push for people to get into STEM. But getting into STEM without getting into biotech specifically doesn't really do the job for you. You need to have as many biotech experts as you possibly can, because the Chinese are just putting them out in thousands. Our education system's great, and our products are great, our people. But we've got to get them directed into these fields, both, by the way, not just for the private sector, but for government, because government's the consumer in some ways, and it isn't always the educated consumer.
Okay, great. So I think in my mind, I break it down. It's people, investment, and infrastructure. And so it's really, it gets at the importance of understanding not only the threat, but the capabilities, right? Because we really want to understand what's coming down the pike. And that comes down to having, a strong, technically proficient workforce that can understand these technologies, but also the convergence of different kinds of technologies and the impact that that's going to have. Because I think that's what we're talking about when we're talking about how do we use AI as a tool of discovery. It's looking at our own infrastructure. I've come up with, we can't protect what we don't have. And in a lot of ways, especially coming back to that manufacturing piece and being able to do things at scale, we don't have that capacity. And so we really need to think of that as part of national security and part of our critical infrastructure. And we have to look at how do we compete, and that'll be really important. And that I'm going to put it out there that we shouldn't reward China's national champions. They don't act as normal companies. They support China's industrial policies. They create an unequal playing field, and they have those ties back to the CCP. And so that is something that we shouldn't reward, both for market access as well as allowing them to be part of the development cycle.
Sure. I think quickly, I would just say that, are we in a position to detect a man-made or natural threat across the U.S. government? I share the Congressman's comments on WHO. I think, one of the things when we're talking about medical countermeasures, that's at least in the draft that I saw, is that the WHO would mandate receiving 20% of all of those medical countermeasures. And given the mismanagement, not just COVID and elsewhere, of the WHO, that's not something that I think the United States should be doing. The other part is the response, both the internal response and how will that, I think policy-wise, we have policy mechanisms. We have the NSC, we have the DPC, we have other parts of the White House. It's once you get into the full-on, day-to-day response, what will that look like? And then the comments about working with our allies, I think, having a conversation amongst allies, because the WHO is not focused on this and is focused on other things for some unknown reason, having an honest conversation with our allies and partners about how each of us are prepared for these things and what we can do, whether it's putting some of those things outside of the United States so that we can work together to address some of these again, because we're going to see more non-cooperative states than cooperative states, and how we address that is going to be the important challenge going forward.
I think from my perspective, from an industry perspective, it goes back to the paradigm shift. We're world leaders in software, analytics, and AI, and we as a country deserve to utilize that for our national security. And so finding a way to encourage and make people feel comfortable with software buys, which is a very different process a lot of times than traditional buying, is a big and important change.
I'm partial to the idea if the NDA can fit this in of a joint biosurveillance center of excellence that we put some money up for and Taiwan put some money up for at the American Enterprise Institute in Taiwan, and looks at pandemic responses, gets a cutting edge into the Chinese language and social media and so forth. And I think that idea should be explored.
Thank you. We have time for a few questions. If anyone in the audience has a question today, feel free to raise your hand and speak up.
Or on social media as well, you can ask, or through our channels.
See what a great job you all did?
Silence the crowd.
Anything on social media, Dan, coming through?
Nothing that I could see.
Then I'll just continue with this conversation that we were just having. You talk about a frustration. We had, I think it was 22 physicians, dentists, and pharmacists, August 2 years ago, reach out to the Secretary of Defense suggesting that the military take the opportunity to draw blood on every member of the military, to check them for antibodies and T cells related to COVID. Get their history. Were you vaccinated? Which vaccine did you get? When did you get it? Did you have COVID that you know of? When was that? And we could get some idea about the longevity of immunological response that you have, either from natural or from the vaccine itself, and really gain a lot of knowledge. Never got an answer, kept pushing. And I copied one of the surgeons general, military research, et cetera. I'm a soldier, they draw blood on us all the time. And so we can do this, and it would be a great tool for us to learn from. Finally got a letter back from the Secretary's office. Said, the mandate's been lifted. Wasn't a question, the mandate. It was a question on actually trying to learn something. So these are the challenges that we even have in Congress. And we kept pursuing it. Finally got a letter saying, well, we've done this and this in this study. So could you give me the results of those? Haven't gotten them. You know, when you talk about whole government response, there's got to be some way, someone that's going to say, this is a good idea, this is a bad idea, let's do it, let's not do it, and it can't just get buried somewhere in one of those silos. So a frustration for me. Bottom line, detection, attribution, treatment. I would love if like, oh, here's a viral sequence, plug it in, here's what the vaccine should look like, and here's what your monoclonal antibody should look like, and all your other treatments, and do it just like that. Any thoughts on that idea?
Well, I think I'd highlight, first of all, I'll highlight sort of the ethereal, which is that I think the field of protein folding prediction is advancing rapidly, right? And that's one key step in thinking about therapeutics. And there are many other things that are being enabled by software and AI that can speed the identification of lead compounds and the testing and then the rapid manufacturing. And you've mentioned a number of times biomanufacturing at scale. That's a critical enabler for us. I would also say that actually, based on what we have to collect today just in medical records, there's a lot of opportunity for harmonizing data and then mining it backwards to look at real-world evidence. So at NIH, for example, there's the N3C Collaborative, which is data, I believe, from 2021. I won't get into the details, but basically it's a large harmonized set of anonymized clinical data from people who had COVID. And it took software to first harmonize it and allow it to be searchable. But since then, there have been 100 papers published giving new insights about COVID. Everything from physiological responses to things about communities, rural versus urban, what was better, what was worse. So I think there's a lot of promise out there if we can apply the tools effectively. And again, it's a shift in thinking. It is a real paradigm shift.
Thank you. Well, we can get into also reporting and sharing of data and the logistics associated. I think our military did a good job of getting the vaccine out across the country. There were positives through all of this, for sure. So I think it was a great discussion today, and I want to thank you all for being here. We really covered everything that I had hoped that we would be able to cover, and then some. But I think hopefully you can see the importance to our national security, to our national health security, and the Congress needs to keep working on these issues in a detailed way, and in conjunction with our agencies, not just having an oversight over the agencies. I think we really need to have this back and forth. And when we talk about Congress, Congress is the voice of the American people. And, we go outside the Beltway, we go home, and we deal with the people in our district and around the country that deal with the issues. So, as a member of the Intelligence Committee and the chairing the pandemic subcommittee, we got a lot of work to do. We want to continue to get input from you because we are looking for a path forward, and this is what we're talking about today. What are some of the solutions that we should try to implement? So again, thank you all for joining us here today. I want to thank AEI again. This was a great panel today, and I appreciate you all taking the time to be here. Thank you. Thank you.